We're privileged today, friends, to have an oration to be delivered by Dr. Shane Kenna. Dr. Kenna is one of the foremost authorities on the Fenians in the country. He's also a renowned author and has published works on the Fenians and is in the process of completing other works at the moment. Thank you, Shane.
It's a pleasure and a privilege to speak to you here today in Glasnevin Cemetery. It's a truly inspiring place. It's inspiring to be here and to see so many of you have come here today from all across Ireland to stand here by the graves of Christopher Dowling and James Birmingham. I would like to thank the National Graves Association of Ireland for their outstanding work in preserving the graves of all those who gave their life for Ireland, and also the work in preserving the memories of our history as well. It's a privilege to stand here today alongside the National Graves Association, who do such sterling work in commemorating and talking and speaking about our history and the graves of our national dead. I'd also like to thank the staff of Glasnevin Museum and Cemetery for also facilitating this event today. The fact that we are gathered here today over the graves of two Fenians, Christopher Dowling and James Birmingham, is evidence of the importance of Fenianism within Irish history and their enduring legacy within the evolution of modern Ireland. The two men we are here today to remember have largely been forgotten until today by Irish history. They were ordinary individuals who lived extraordinary lives. Dowling had lived in Kevin Street in Dublin. He worked as a gas fitter. James Birmingham lived in Cuff Street in Dublin and he worked as a plumber. While today we are here to remember Christopher Dowling and James Birmingham, we also remember the veritable who's who of the Fenian movement that rest within the walls of this cemetery and are commemorated within the walls of this cemetery. We also remember James Stephens, we remember John O'Mahony, we remember Jeremiah O'Donovan Rossa, we remember P.W. Nally, we remember Skin the Goat, we remember John DeBoy, Stephen Donoghue, Thomas Farrell, Henry Rolls, James Egan and James O'Connor, to name a few. Equally, we remember Patrick O'Donnell and the Manchester Martyrs. While not at rest in Glasnevin Cemetery, their bodies remain in prisons in England. They are commemorated in this cemetery. We also remember Joseph Poole, who was wrongly executed in Richmond Jail in Dublin in December 1883. Poole is buried within the grounds of what today is Griffith College in Dublin. There are also a further 5 Fenians who are not here that I would like to remember. These are the 5 remaining prisoners of Kilmainham Jail in Dublin, and these represent what is known as the Irish National Invincibles. These men are Joseph Brady, Daniel Curley, Michael Fagan, Thomas Caffery and Timothy Kelly. These men are still buried in Kilmainham Jail for their 131st year. Unlike Christopher Dowling or James Birmingham, their place of burial remains in an unmarked grave, sealed off from the public, and their names are largely an afterthought within Irish history. This must not continue. As we approach 131 years since their burial in Kilmainham Jail, the question must be asked, should the Invincibles still be imprisoned within that former prison? Or should their remains be reinterred and given a proper funeral, given a proper burial inside of this fine cemetery we're standing here today, so that the family can come, as the families like the Birminghams and the Dowlings here today, and celebrate their memory. Perhaps out of decency to their families this should be done. Like all who played their part within Fenianism, they should and must be remembered. And today, as we celebrate the lives of Birmingham and Dowling, we do not forget those who are not here today. We do not forget those who are not given the proper right of burial. All of these individuals belong to Fenianism. All of these individuals are Fenians. But this raises the question, who exactly were the Fenians? Who are these men who are so promptly spoken of within Irish history? And why are we here today to commemorate Christopher Dowling and James Birmingham? The Fenians are, and will always remain, one of the most important social and political movements within modern Irish history. Established almost simultaneously in Dublin and New York in 1858, the Fenians take their place within the great pantheon of Irish nationalist heroes. Indeed, the Fenians bestrode Irish history like a colossus, influencing not only Irish politics, but also sport, literature, cultural revival, and the very people themselves. They introduced a national pride within the Irish people. Many have wrongly asserted that the Fenians have no ideology. Many have wrongly asserted that the Fenians represented a social outlet for individuals to feel part of, with patriotism becoming, as one contemporary noted, part of a pastime. This analysis is wrong. Let no one debate the Fenian movement from its importance within Irish history. Fenianism represented a post-famine Irish republicanism, which was unbending, unyielding, and had sought to establish an independent and democratic secular Irish republic. Fenianism stood up, and Fenianism in this endeavour had been inspired by Wolfe Tone, the founder of Irish republicanism, when he famously declared his ambition of breaking the connection with Great Britain. The Fenians felt no disdain for the British people, but felt disdain for the British government's claim to govern Ireland, and they argued that that the British government had to be coerced into granting this country's independence. Equally, the Fenians realised that an independent Ireland was nothing unless it was accompanied by her people, united and at peace amongst each other. They had sought to unite the Irish people, like those who had come before them. They had sought to unite them under the common banner of Irishness. They were particularly influenced by the inclusive republicanism of Henry Joy, of Thomas Davis, of Theobald Wolfe-Tone, of Francis Marr and Robert Emmet. The Fenians believed that the Irish nation had a right to be independent. They believed that the nation consisted of all of Ireland's children, irrespective of cultural, political or religious or social difference. In 1867, the Fenians had led a rebellion to establish a democratic republic in the hope that future generations would never have to act as they did. James Birmingham had fought with distinction during the Fenian Rebellion in 1867. He had been part of the failed Fenian assault on Tala village, and as such was his status in the Fenian movement that in 1901, in this cemetery, this man was the pallbearer for the remains of James Stephens, the founder of the Fenian movement, standing alongside leading Fenian activists such as Michael Davitt, a great figure within Irish history, Charles Doran, Michael Lambert, William Brophy and William Hickey. Like those which had come before it, however, the Fenian Rebellion of 1867 was undermined by the overwhelming strength of the British Army and the police force within Ireland, and perhaps most insidiously, the presence of paid spies and informers within the national ranks. While Fenianism was not utterly defeated in the aftermath of the rebellion, many had concluded that Fenianism had effectively shot its bolt, and that Fenianism had come to an end, that the Fenians were gone. They were wrong. The Fenians never went away. For the first time within Irish history, a defeated republican movement didn't go away. It reorganised, and it came back as a tightly knit revolutionary conspiracy. The Fenians realised that republicanism in Ireland could not stand stagnant. Republicanism within this country needed to be adaptable to an ever-changing reality, an ever-changing resulting from evolving circumstances affecting the Irish people. And rather than disappear into history as the United Irishmen or the Young Irelanders before them, the Fenians at home and abroad reorganised themselves into that tightly knit conspiracy that I spoke of. They reorganised themselves into a revolutionary grouping that remained determined to advocate the Republic, to strike for the Republic, and if necessary, pass the torch of the Republic onto future generations. In the 1870s, the Fenians were undergoing their period of thorough and real regeneration. In Ireland, they had established a Supreme Council to direct the activities of the Irish Republican Brotherhood. While in America, Clan na Gael now became the dominant force within Irish-American politics. Realising that Fenianism could not defeat the much superior resources of the British Army in open battle, the movement consigned itself to a policy of waiting for British difficulty, for a moment that was termed Ireland's opportunity. This was, however, controversial. It was incredibly controversial as a strategy, as many within the movement, at home and abroad, increasingly began to argue that this would only facilitate stagnation within republicanism, and republicanism needed a further injection. It needed rejuvenation. In the dying years of the 1870s, there was increasing suggestions of how and what Fenianism could do to rejuvenate the movement. While many argued for the logic of waiting for British difficulty as a precursor to a revolution in Ireland, others were determined to take immediate direct action. And this introduces us to James Birmingham and Christopher Dowling. In the 1880s, the Fenians had undertaken the first sustained bombing campaign in Great Britain. They attacked a staggering list of targets, including Whitehall, the administrative centre of the British government, the London Underground, Pall Mall, where they destroyed the Junior Carlton Club, and they attempted to blow up Nelson's Pillar. They also blew up Scotland Yard. Those of you who are familiar with London will know today we have New Scotland Yard. The reason we have New Scotland Yard is because the Fenians blew up Old Scotland Yard. They actually detonated a bomb within the chamber of the British House of Commons in an event forever immortalised as Dynamite Saturday. Indeed, Tom Clark, the future Tyrone signatory of the Easter Proclamation of 1916, was arrested as part of this campaign in April of 1883. He was captured with several bags of homemade nitroglycerin explosive. He'd been involved in a conspiracy to rather ambitiously blow up Big Ben Clock Tower in central London and the very seat of the British House of Commons itself. While his great friend, John Daly, the uncle of Ned Daly, executed for his role in the Easter Rising of 1916, was arrested the following year with explosives he had intended to throw from the visitors' gallery of the House of Commons onto the government front bench. British intelligence, who facilitated the passing of the bombs to John Daly, recalled that John Daly was, to quote British intelligence, the most bloody-minded fanatic since Guy Fawkes. Parallel to the Fenian dynamite campaign, the Ireland of Dowling and Birmingham was very different to the Ireland of today. Between 1879 to 1882, there's a great social revolution within this country. It's known as the Land War. It's a conflict fought between opposing forces of power and privilege on the one side, and the poor and the marginalised on the other. In this social conflict, tenant farmers were organised under the effective leadership that led effectively a movement that was called the Land League, which in itself was organised and within the Fenian movement, albeit with marginal opposition from the IRB Supreme Council. To meet this challenge, the British government introduced a coercionist policy in Ireland, known as the Protection of Person and Property Bill. It allowed the government to detain, without trial, any individual suspected of treasonable or agrarian offence. The most high profile of those to have been arrested was actually Charles Stuart Parnell, who also lies buried in the cemetery today. Against this background, a number of Fenians met in Dublin and they met in London with American support, and they established an assassination committee within the ranks of Dublin Fenianism. And they effectively became known as the Irish National Invincibles. They would ultimately assassinate two of the British government's most important administrators within this country, Lord Frederick Cavendish and Thomas Henry Burke, on May 6, 1882, in what became known as the Phoenix Park assassinations. Burke and two of the Invincibles, Henry Rolls and Skin the Goat, rest here in Glasnevin. As I mentioned earlier, 5 men still reside in Kilmainham Jail in an unmarked grave. The lives of Dowling and Birmingham are inextricably linked to the Invincibles and the experience of the Fenian dynamite campaign. Given the state of Dublin in the aftermath of the Phoenix Park assassinations and an upsurge in Fenian activity following those assassinations in the park, police detectives were actively working up known Fenian districts, haunts and sympathisers. This was an operation of an immense scale, with ordinary police officers taken off their beats and regular duties to augment the counter-Fenian operation. While the police operation had not been successful, it had failed to deliver solid arrests and arms fines. Police had noticed that Fenian activists had regularly assembled on O'Connell Street in Dublin. By the 25th of November 1882, a Fenian group assembled at Abbey Street in Dublin. It left O'Connell Street. Arriving at Abbey Street, the police noticed the presence of a number of men at Bachelor's Walk, standing in a laneway looking toward Abbey Street. Walking on to the other side of the street to the original grouping, they were already being followed. The police stumbled on 2 rival Fenian gangs. 2 squads, one representing the Supreme Council faction and the other representing the Stephensite faction, were determined to fight over control of a weapons cache in Dublin. They opened fire on each other in what became known as the Battle of Abbey Street. A police officer, Constable Cox, was shot, presumably by friendly fire, by his own police force, the Dublin Metropolitan Police, just outside what today is Independent House. The newspapers reported that Cox had been shot by Christopher Dowling, who had fallen with Constable Cox. A colleague of Dowling, Thomas Devine, had also been shot and was involved in a scuffle with another policeman named Eastwood. When the Battle of Abbey Street had come to a halt, Cox was dead. Eastwood, Dowling and Devine were injured and they were taken to the nearby Jervis Street Hospital, which today is Jervis Street Shopping Centre. A further 2 Fenians named William Wordsworth and Thomas Ryan were also arrested, while later the Fenian Joe Poole who was not there on the day, was also arrested as an accessory to the killing of Cox. In Jervis Street Hospital, Dowling was noticed to be in great pain and was very likely to die. He was wounded in the shoulder. He was grazed by a bullet on his right wrist. He had a lacerated wound on his neck. He had a fractured skull inflicted by the butt of a police revolver in his head. Clearing his body of blood and blood-stained clothes, it was noted by a doctor that his hat was literally riddled with bullets. To the bewilderment of the hospital staff, Christopher Dowling, despite his wounds, incredibly claimed to a nurse that he felt no pain whatsoever. Christopher Dowling made a full recovery, but as he lay in Jervis Street Hospital with Devine, a large Republican crowd had gathered around the hospital surrounding the building. The crowd had apparently sought the release of Dowling and Devine. The hospital was now placed into a lockdown. As the crowd grew ever stronger, mounted police soon after arrived, this time with drawn swords, and they quickly forced a dispersal of the crowd and reinforced security within the building. Dowling was eventually sentenced to 10 years of imprisonment. His comrade, Devine, became an informer, his evidence playing a part in the execution of Joseph Poole in December 1883. Poole, as I mentioned earlier, like the Invincibles, is still buried within an unmarked grave. This unmarked grave, as you might remember I mentioned earlier, today resides in Griffith College in Dublin. Similarly, the experience of the Fenian dynamite campaign came to be connected to Birmingham. In total, 15 men were arrested for their involvement in the dynamite campaign. The prisoners were treated as special men and were placed within a prison system favouring silence, supervision and separation. The title of special men was reserved specifically for the dynamitard convict and was terrifying, given that it entailed strict rules and even stricter punishments. These special men found that jailers and wardens treated them as they pleased, with no reference to the prison rules, often relinquishing ordinary rules and prison regulation and implementing an unvarying system of persistent harassment against the dynamitards. According to the dynamitard prisoner, Tom Clark, to quote Tom Clark, "The ordinary rules regarding the treatment of prisoners, which to some extent shield them from foul play and the caprice of petty officers, these rules, as far as they did that, were in our case set aside. There was a scientific system of perpetual and persistent harassing morning, noon and night, and on through the night, harassing always and at all times, harassing with bread and water punishments, and other punishments, with no sleep torture and other tortures. This system was applied to Irish prisoners, and to them only, and it was specially designed to destroy us mentally or physically, to kill or drive insane." James Birmingham, the man whose grave we are standing at today, was one of those remarkable men who argued that enough was enough. He became a vocal advocate of dynamitards' rights while in prison, and had become the mainstay of an Amnesty association, seeking the release of Fenian prisoners. Birmingham was the honorary treasurer of the Amnesty Association. The Freeman's Journal, a popular Dublin newspaper, recalled of James Birmingham that in the cause of amnesty, no one did more unsparing or untiring work than James Birmingham. Birmingham had actually defined the ambition of the Amnesty Association as, to quote Birmingham, "founded for the sole aim and effort to obtain the release of the Irish political prisoners in British jails, to save them from being forgotten, and to mitigate, as far as possible, the inhumanity of their treatment by keeping their case constantly before public opinion." Birmingham was determined that Fenian prisoners were not going to be abandoned, and vocally kept the harrowing story of their horror alive, particularly with reference to the dynamitard prisoners. They were faced by a strict regime of silence, supervision and separation. Such was the strain on many of the imprisoned Fenians and dynamitards that they developed insanity. Such were the conditions that John Daly, realising that his food was being regularly poisoned by a British jailer, was forced into a hunger strike. Birmingham and men like him within the Amnesty Association were not prepared to allow the Fenians and the dynamitards to be forgotten. And he regularly took to the press to advocate their release and highlight their inhumane conditions. In 1896, he had organised a homecoming for the dynamitard prisoner James J. Murphy, also known as Alfred Whitehead. Such were the rigours of the Victorian prison system, however, that Murphy had developed acute insanity while at prison. The same could be said of Murphy's comrade, Dr. Thomas Gallagher, who had been examined by several doctors. Each one of these doctors had indicated that Gallagher was lying. These doctors were British doctors. They had argued that Gallagher was lying, he had not developed insanity. The Amnesty Association and James Birmingham had forced the British government to allow an American doctor to look at Dr. Gallagher. The American doctor confirmed that he had indeed developed sanity. The Home Office in London disagreed. They sent a further doctor in, a British doctor. That doctor undermined what the American doctor said, and as a result Gallagher spent more time in prison until he was eventually released as a result of the work of the Amnesty Association. Gallagher, when he was released from jail, was greeted by Birmingham. Birmingham recalled that Gallagher was gaunt, he was frail, he was vacant, and he was melancholy. He was a shadow of his former self. Both of these men that I mentioned, Murphy and Gallagher, who developed insanity, they would die in American asylums. It was only Tom Clark who actually survived the gruelling ordeal of prison life. Birmingham had regular meetings with the imprisoned Tom Clark while he was imprisoned over in Britain. They became great friends, and he reported to the media and his colleagues within the Amnesty Association how Clark was complaining of prolonged suffering while he was in prison. Upon Clark's release in 1898, Birmingham was the first man to meet Thomas Clark and welcome him home. A procession had actually been organised in Dublin to mark Clark's arrival back to the city. Clark was joined by other dynamitards, Henry Dalton and Timothy Featherstone. Birmingham had marched at the top of the procession with Thomas Clark. The procession made its way to the Rotunda in Dublin, where a rally was scheduled to take place in the round room of that historic building. National music was played by several bands, and flags and banners were borne by many of the contingents taking part. Hundreds of torches were carried in the procession, and their brilliant glare lighted up the streets. And there were immense crowds and spectators who were there to see those who had come. This ran parallel to the unfurling of green and American flags, and a contingent carrying carved wooden pikes and nationalist banners. Arriving in the round room of the Rotunda, there was a huge crowd organised to celebrate the cause of amnesty, including John and Willie Redmond of the Irish Parliamentary Party. John Redmond, who had actually campaigned for a general amnesty of the dynamitards in Parliament, had announced, if you can believe this from John Redmond, "We rejoice that their spirit is still undaunted, and that their love for the land of their birth is as ardent now as it was on the day when they had entered prison." Thomas Clark followed Redmond onto the platform in the Rotunda round room and announced, to quote Thomas Clark, "Tonight I am a free man, thanks to the workings of the Amnesty Association. Had no Amnesty Association existed, we would not have now escaped the horrors of the prison system. We would have been in the prison system left either mad or dead. The treatment we were subjected to in prison was calculated to destroy us mentally and physically." Some years before Clark was released from jail, James Birmingham had actively worked with the dynamitards to secure their release. He had actively worked with Christopher Dowling as well from prison. Dowling, like the dynamitards, had suffered the rigours of the Victorian prison system, and his health had dramatically been affected by the prison regime. Dowling had lost his right eye while in prison. He'd been struck in the eye with a piece of red-hot steel while a prisoner. Birmingham, with Michael Lambert and James Egan, had initiated what they called the Dowling Fund, seeking to release Christopher Dowling. It was based on popular subscriptions. It had sought to facilitate his release from jail and support his family in his eventual re-entering into civilian society. Such was the extent of their campaign, which is based on Dowling's declining health, that Michael Davitt had actually interjected and called upon the British government to support the amnesty of Fenian prisoners. Dowling was released on the 5th of February 1895. He was much reduced as a character. One contemporary recalled of Christopher Dowling, his looks add 18 years to his age, which is only 39. His nervous system is completely disarranged, and he intends to have recourse for a couple of months in country life with the hope that will all set him up in health. With his health broken by the prison system, Dowling died within a year of his release. The Amnesty Association decided that they would bury this man in this wonderful cemetery that is so close to the pulse of Irish history. There had been an outpouring of sympathy from ordinary Dubliners and his political associates. Reporting the scene from the cemetery over 100 years ago, one newspaper commented, and if I can quote, "A very large attendance of the general public testified to the esteem in which the deceased was held, and to the general sympathy with his family, and indignation at the cruel prison system. His funeral procession had begun at 10 o'clock in the morning, but it did not reach this cemetery until 2 p.m. in the afternoon. It had travelled through Dublin City, and everywhere it had travelled, his remains were met by large crowds. As his funeral cortege entered this cemetery, there was a large procession, including the St. Peter's Brass Band from nearby Phibsborough, the P.W. Nally Club, John Dowling, Christopher's brother, James Birmingham, Michael Lambert, and members of the Amnesty Association. Birmingham and Lambert had acted as the leading marshals of the funeral for this man inside of this graveyard. Buoyed on by the success of the Amnesty Association, increasingly advanced nationalists argued that they should get involved in politics. They increasingly argued that it was necessary to get involved in politics at a local and national level. The idea was for Irish nationalists to control politics at local and national levels within Ireland, facilitating the emergence of a powerful independence movement within this country. As part of this strategy, in 1899, James Birmingham was nominated for a position of the Poor Law Guardian for South Dublin. He withdrew his candidacy at the last minute. The following year he again stood for election, this time to the County Council, but he was defeated. In 1902 and again in 1905, he was elected to the South Dublin Board of Guardians, where he served with one of the leading figures of the former Invincible Committee, a man called James Mullet, who was chairman of the South Dublin Union. As nationalists increasingly adopted more militant lines in local government, there was a growing sense of nationality amongst the Irish people. An animated meeting of Dublin City Council actually took place on the 14th of March 1900. This is prior to the visit of Queen Victoria of Great Britain. The meeting sat to, quote, "consider and decide what action should be taken by the corporation in connection with the approaching visit of Her Majesty the Queen." On the following day, the Freeman's Journal reported this meeting, and they reported that the gallery of the County Council was not opened until 3 minutes to 1, and when it was opened it was filled almost immediately, the crowd cheering and shouting, "God save Ireland." Before the opening of the public gallery, a few privileged citizens were actually admitted to the gallery inside the outer barrier. Among those in the gallery that day were James Birmingham and his good friend Michael Lambert, who heartily joined in chorus of "God Save Ireland" and shouted support for those who were against the royal visit. James Birmingham died all too soon on the 4th of June 1907. His funeral, at this point, had been the scene of the great outpouring of grief and mourning. The Irish Independent newspaper spoke of an attendance that was extraordinarily large and counted among the mourners many trade unionists, many political activists, veterans of the 1867 Fenian Rebellion who fought beside him at the Battle of Tala, politicians, and most importantly, his old friend Michael Lambert. The old Fenian had been laid to rest with his wife Margaret, who had died the previous year. James Birmingham and Christopher Dowling were two remarkable Fenians. The Ireland they had both sought to establish and achieve was one of unity and peace, taking its place amongst the nations of the earth. The Ireland which they had sought to achieve may not yet exist, but we in our present generation owe men like Dowling and Birmingham a great deal. It was their efforts and their endeavours which kept the flame alive and passed the torch to future generations. We have come here today to commemorate and to celebrate the lives of these men and to remember the Fenians who reside here today, Glasnevin in Dublin. In their day, the Fenians were denigrated, they were condemned, and they were slandered. In reality, however, these men were ordinary individuals like you or I. The Fenians, such as Christopher Dowling and James Birmingham, were uncompromising in their love of this country and their belief that Ireland should be an independent country, taking its place amongst the nations of the earth. The Fenians, such as Christopher Dowling and James Birmingham, acted as the guardians of the Irish Republic. They were ordinary men who in extraordinary and difficult circumstances found the inner strength, determination and courage to stand against injustice and oppression within this country, to demand the rights and entitlements of the Irish nation. As we stand here today, happy to commemorate these men, our task, our duty, is to learn from our past and study our history, to read our history. Through this, and through this only, we can make their vision of a new Ireland a reality. A cóirde go raibh míle maith go raibh go léir.